Let's look at plant life cycles and take a dive into plant reproduction. So be able to define diploid, haploid, gamete, sporophyte, gametophyte, spore, zygote, germination, embryo sac, and pollen. It's a lot of vocabulary words, and we are going to be using them as we describe plant reproduction. Be able to draw the angiosperm life cycle, that's the alternation of generations, and be able to compare the plant life cycle to the vertebrate life cycle. We're going to do this largely in class, creating a Venn diagram on the board. The vertebrate life cycle. This is probably what you're familiar with if you've taken, well, any biology classes or any classes that maybe look at frog reproduction. Because we're going to take the frog example. There are two different ploidy levels here. Diploid is having two copies of the genome. That's right, that 23andMe thing that you have, that shows the two copies for every single one of your chromosomes. One from your mother, one from your father. You are a diploid organism. Of course, this means that there must be a haploid stage as well. And this is when you have one copy of the genome. This isn't, of course, you, but the two gametes that made you. Gametes are haploid cells used for reproduction. Eggs or sperm are both gametes, and when the gametes fuse, you have 1 plus 1 equaling 2. Haploid plus haploid equaling diploid. And a zygote is what we call two fused gametes, and that is going to give rise to an embryo. Now in plants, it's the same but different, because in the plants you have, of course, gametes, both male and female, eggs and sperm, but these are not made by the adult diploid organism. These are made by something called the gametophyte. Gamete phyte, gamete plant. This makes the gametes. So the gametophyte will make either sperm or eggs. Now, where does a gametophyte come from? It comes from a spore. And spores are made by the sporophyte. Spore, phyte. Spore plant. This is a plant that makes spores. Both the gametophyte and the sporophyte are considered individual plants. Now, the spores are going to divide to make a gametophyte, and the gametophyte will give rise to gametes, which will fuse to make a zygote, which will grow to make a sporophyte, which will undergo meiosis to make spores. Now, we're not memorizing mitosis or meiosis, but suffice it to say, meiosis is when you go from 2 copies to 1 copy, and mitosis is when you go from either 1 to 1 or 2 to 2. Compare these two life cycles. I would recommend that you make a Venn diagram with things that they share, such as making gametes, and things that they do not share, like the gametophyte making gametes instead of the adult organism. Now, a term we're going to be using here and using quite often is the term germination. It's when a seed or a spore takes in water and begins to grow. So we see germination like in this squash plant where the seed's going to take in water, make the little leaves come out of the soil and begin to grow. That's germination. Well, germination is also when pollen grains begin to grow. So here's what the female gametophyte looks like in angiosperms. Now, this is going to be angiosperm specific because we're dealing mainly with flowering plants. This gets more complicated and more interesting in things like mosses or ferns, which we're not really covering in this class. The embryo sac is what the name of the female gametophyte is in angiosperms. It contains 7 cells with 8 nuclei. That central cell actually has 2 nuclei. There is, of course, an egg cell, which is going to get fertilized to make the zygote. The central cell with those 2 nuclei is going to get fertilized to make the endosperm, which is nutrients for the growing embryo. The male gametophyte is a pollen grain. That's right. Whenever you sniff pollen, you are actually putting hundreds, if not thousands, of full-grown plants into your nose, because each gametophyte is technically a plant, and it is full grown when it is, well, a pollen grain. And that full grown is 2 cells. One cell is the tube cell. The other cell is the generative cell. When the pollen grain germinates, it will form a pollen tube, and that generative cell will make 2 male gametes, which are also known as sperm. Now, what happens to these sperm? Well, when the pollen grain lands on the pistil, the stigma specifically, it will germinate because there's water there. The pollen tube will then grow down the style and reach the ovary. As it does so, it delivers 2 sperm. One sperm is going to fertilize the egg, giving rise to the zygote, which will undergo mitosis to make the embryo. The other sperm cell will fertilize that central cell, which is going to give rise to a triploid, that's 3 copies of the genome. And then that is going to undergo mitosis to form the endosperm, which we will talk about later in seeds. So some bonus material. You can stop here if that's all you want for the lecture, but here's some bonus material just because you're a horticulturalist and it's nifty. There are things called perfect and imperfect flowers. Perfect flowers have both pistil and stamen. They make both male and female gametophytes. Imperfect flowers will make either male or female gametophytes, and we can see this on this squash plant. The female flower has that big round thing near the bottom. That's the ovary, and that contains the egg cells, that contains your embryo sacs down there, and those will get fertilized, and you'll end up with a squash with plenty of seeds in it. The male flower just makes pollen, and, well, when it's done, which takes about a morning, and then it just withers away. A plant can make a lot of male flowers. They're pretty cheap. Some more bonus material is something called dioecious plants. Now we have here a monoecious plant. This is actually specifically a plant that will self itself or can reproduce with itself. Monoecious plants have male and female parts on the same flower, like perfect flowers, or male and female flowers on the same plant, like the squash did. Dioecious plants are either male or female. You can see this with holly trees. Holly trees will either make male flowers or they will make female flowers. That's right. You can actually have male and female plants. A fun fact for those of you who want to know, marijuana is actually a dioecious plant with only the female plants being used to make bud. You know, the stuff you would smoke if you did, which you don't because you're a good person. Then we have the bonus material of pin and thrum flowers. You see, you can have pin and thrum flowers. You have the stigma at the top and the anthers at the bottom. It's a pin. Think about a long stigma being like a pin. Then the thrum has the anthers at the top and the stigma at the bottom. This means that an organism that pollinates this will, if it runs into the anthers at the top, will then run into the stigma at the top in another flower. If it runs into the anthers at the bottom, it'll run into the stigma at the bottom in a thrum flower. So this allows your outcrossing. There's also something called stigma exsertion, and yes, that's spelled right. That's how far the stigma goes out from the anther cone. This is more specifically in your nightshade plants. The farther the stigma goes out, the less chance it'll get pollen from its own flower, and the higher chance it will outcross. Now, you don't want outcrossing being required for tomato plants. You want them to self-pollinate and make your tomatoes reliably. So there has actually been selective breeding to make the stigma occur inside the anthers and automatically get self-pollinated.